my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
And I want to welcome you back to NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. My name is Neil Clements, #BlackDogGrowling, and I'd like to welcome my co-hosts, Matthew Martin and Dr. Timothy Christie. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt.
Now, we've been very consistent on this show when we discuss the outcomes that we're looking for and the reason for which we do this show. One of the outcomes that we've been calling for is a public inquiry, whole of government approach into systemic discrimination. Another very important outcome that we discuss every show is the criminalization of racial discrimination. And another piece that we've talked about less, but is in movement now in the background, is adding Black history education to the official curriculums in our province specifically, but we think that's a nationwide outcome. So today, we'd like to switch it up a little bit. We're going to focus on systemic discrimination in 3 specific areas and how that has affected the outcomes of our community. One, we're going to look at systemic discrimination in specifically the funding of nonprofit or NGO organizations which deal specifically with culture. We're also going to speak about systemic discrimination and the outcomes thereof in healthcare, and we'll also discuss systemic discrimination nationwide approach when it comes to the criminal justice system and the outcomes for our communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous, in those 3 areas. And to open it up today, I'd like to welcome my colleague Matthew Martin, who is also the president of Black Lives Matter, to discuss the idea of systemic discrimination in the nonprofit sector. So Matthew, I'd like to turn it over to you, and I'm really interested in what you've got to say today.
Perfect. Well, I think really I want to set the scene up. I've sat in lots of meetings with all kinds of different organizations as stakeholder community engagements, and I've really noticed a real consistent trend. You go to a meeting, you do your pleasantries, which are, it's always great to do. From there, though, it's a lot of just stroking egos, how great an organization is doing at something, regardless of if from the public perception they are doing great or not. There's no fault in these organizations, businesses, whatever it may be. From there, it's really just nothing getting done. Myself, I'd love to see, as we've discussed many times, the criminalization of racism, really the elimination of systemic racism, and just to start addressing real issues that are present within the Black community, within our Indigenous communities, and just start addressing these things. But I've noticed consistently in these meetings, nothing really gets done. That has led me to do a lot of research of, what's going on to make other organizations so afraid to say what you're doing is not working. One thing I come back to, and you can see, and I've seen in my research, is a lot of these organizations offer anti-racism, inclusion training, bias awareness training, that they, as services, offer to these organizations, whether they do it for free or for payment. My theory is it's more likely for a payment or for a fee. Otherwise, why are they afraid to address them? This has led me into a lot of research of why is there nothing being done. It's great to see these trainings happening within organizations on paper, but in the reality of things, there's a lot of stuff they're not addressing. One of these things is we're offering this anti-racism training, this training, and at the end of the day, we still have all white councils, we still have all white MLAs, all white MPs. We're not seeing any inclusivity based on a culture into these fields. So we're not addressing any real problems of systemic racism. What's stopping Black community members from being on police forces? What's stopping our Black community members being on council? What do these issues look like? So the more you dig into it and the more research I've done, we're looking at some organizations getting $8 to $10 million a year in funding to promote these anti-racism trainings that in my opinion are not producing any results.
Right.
We're still seeing the same thing 10 years ago that we are today. All white municipality workers, all white governments, nothing's changing. But we're continuing to see the shell out of money, but no problems being solved.
And if I might, you just said, a decade of funding organizations for the purpose of, I'll call it the protection of culture. But here we were just last summer doing a rally in King Square in St. John saying nothing has changed. So to your point, I would agree. Dr. Christie, any comment there?
I think I love the introduction of this topic, Matthew. If you look at, say, these organizations, so some places are getting funding for decades, literally. And they're well-intentioned and they're working hard, but working hard isn't good enough if you're not making a difference. So how can you tell if you made a difference or not? Like Matthew said, the proof is in the pudding. If the entire cabinet for the provincial government is white, if our MLAs are white, if our city council here is white, if our board of police commissioners are white, no matter what these groups are doing, they're working hard, but are they making a difference? So I think that the funding shouldn't necessarily be focusing on, say, helping people adjust to this new environment.
Right.
Helping them learn how to live in, say, the New Brunswick context, because immigration is one of the only ways that our province is going to grow. We need to fix the problems. When we have immigrants come here, they shouldn't have to assimilate. They shouldn't have to try to figure out how to navigate systemic discrimination. Our government and our leaders should be dismantling systemic discrimination. They should be eliminating it. And that requires getting rid of the racists. That means if there are barriers to inclusion, they should be addressing them. So right now, the government, say the federal government that's sending to New Brunswick between $8 and $10 million a year to support multiculturalism, that's not to support changing the society. That's to support status quo. Just help people figure out how to live within the status quo. And I think what we're calling for is actually changing the structures in society, fixing the problems, eliminating systemic discrimination, requiring that our city councillors, our provincial government, our board of police commissioners have black people on them. And it's inexcusable that we don't.
And I'm going to give it back to Matthew in a moment, but I'll make a quick comment on your statements. You mentioned, St. John specifically being our home. It's where I understand best. But you mentioned the Board of Police Commissioners, the councils. Both of those organizations have received this anti-racism training from local organizations over the course of years, and I'm not seeing any change, to your point, and to your point.
And from that, I would even say, we don't see the proof in the pudding in regards to our municipalities still being consistently white. But on top of which, what happens if, say, someone takes that training and it goes, yeah, they are racist? What happens to that individual? Are they fired? Are they let go?
Right.
Which, goes on top of what you were saying here is if we're actually trying to dismantle systemic racism, the real thing that should happen is that individual is said to be racist. They're removed from whatever position that may be, because otherwise they're just going to be adding to continuing to keep our white governments, our white police forces, our white board. If to just acknowledge the fact that, hey, they might be a little bit racist, keep them in their position, you're not really changing or fixing anything. You've just acknowledged that there's a problem, and you're just going to let them grow and spread their hatred.
And if I can jump in there,
Absolutely.
Matthew, one of the problems with these anti-racism education programs is that it works from the premise that racism is a result of ignorance, and that if you educate people, they won't be racist. I would disagree. I think racism is evil and it's malicious. So when someone calls you the N-word, if someone fires you because of your color, if someone doesn't rent to you because of your color, if you can't get a job interview because of your color, these people know better. It's not lack of understanding, it's pure maliciousness.
Right.
It's not ignorance. So what makes us think that the remedy for addressing systemic discrimination in our environments, in our organizations, is to educate people? And this is why I've been consistently arguing that no, this needs to be a crime. Racial discrimination needs to be a crime and punished accordingly. And then if people want to get sensitivity training or education or something, that's fine, and they can improve themselves. But the fundamental premise is you can't maintain your position of power if you're a racist. So I disagree with the approach that education is a solution. And it's a platitude. Nobody can disagree with education.
Absolutely.
And this is why the government love it, because the government say, we're going to give out a little bit of money to all of these organizations,
Right.
we're going to let them go do education, but we know none of them are actually going to accomplish a damn thing.
And I say often, excuse me, Matthew, I say often, once you know, you can't then not know. But having had an opportunity to see some of your research and the decades, and I'm not suggesting these organizations shouldn't get money, I'm suggesting they should actually have outcomes that are real. But once you know, you can't not know. So after a decade of funding, as an example, and we're still in the same place, there's some ignorance involved, right? And again, it's maybe a different way of using the phrase, Tim, because I completely agree with your statements, haven't thought about them. But there's just an outcome that is, I'm going to ignore it. I once you know, you can't not know, but I'm going to decide, I don't know. But I'll keep taking the money, and I'll keep doing the training, and there are no outcomes because we're still here, right? We're still talking about this.
And back to what Tim said, our both our federal and our provincial government, a lot of the research I did, I found it's easily trackable for what the federal government is giving to who. Our provincial government's a very different story. Now, it's very possible that when I was doing my research, I just wasn't looking at the very minute spots, but I spent extensive hours looking at our provincial government just for funding for multicultural organizations. That being said, like Tim said, we see there's a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. You guys run along and go get your ice cream, but then the real problem is now they're taking the attention away from this whole white leadership, this white overlord type thing that we're seeing in a lot of organizations. They know if you give the little money here, we're keeping food on their tables. They're not going to address the real big issues. We're not really changing much. We're changing maybe 2 or 3 people. Where's the proof in that? But we're not changing is society itself.
It's the classic strategy of divide and conquer.
Absolutely, my
So
friend.
there's a limited pot of money. You have a whole bunch of organizations that just developed. All of them need to sustain themselves. So they start fighting for this little pot of money.
Exactly.
This is intentional by the government. They've put a finite number of resources, and they're not going to give it all to one group. They're going to divide it so they can report that they're supporting these activities, these multicultural activities, but they're not actually doing anything. And I would submit that the not actually doing anything, not achieving any outcomes, is where the problem is. And once again, our focus isn't on the process of helping people learn how to live in the system. We want the system to change. We want them to actually put black people in positions of power and let black people participate in making the decisions that are guiding our province.
Agreed 100%. So let's move on from the nonprofit sector, and I appreciate your information, Matthew, and I appreciate the understanding that I hope our viewers get from that. But Dr. Christie, you also spoke this morning with me about systemic discrimination in healthcare, and it really kind of disturbed me.
Our show is about outcomes. So I just want to give a couple of outcomes. If you're black in Canada, you're twice as likely to develop adult onset diabetes compared to a white person. There was a recent study that came out, and it looked at, it surveyed thousands of people across the country, and black people reported less cardiovascular disease and less incidence of cancer. So the researchers looked and said, how could that be? And the answer is it's something we call survival bias. So the people who filled out the survey in the black community were the ones most likely to survive the disease. Those that were less likely to survive the disease obviously weren't there to fill out the survey. So this is what the authors explained why it looked like. So basically what they would say is that black people in Canada have higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and higher rates of cancer. The question is why? What is there about a black person that makes them have these things? And there is no biological basis that says you're more predisposed to this. And this is where the literature is starting to address racism as one of the determinants of health. And if you look at hospitals and doctors, they only account for less than 25% of the health of a community. The social determinants of health account for a lot more. And this would include things like stable housing, education, income, employment, support networks, and this type of thing. And what the literature is showing is that black people are performing worse on these health outcomes. And I want to challenge our healthcare sector to say, why is that? It's not a physiological thing. It's not the color of my skin that predisposes me to this. What is it? And this is where I think racism is very important. Racism might not be the only explanation, but I think it's a major, major determining factor. So for instance, with the cancer rates, maybe I don't get screened as early as someone else. With diabetes, maybe I don't have access to the same nutrition as someone else. There are things, and we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it like this? And this is where I would say the literature is pretty clear that systemic discrimination within the healthcare sector is what has been driving these outcomes, and we've had them decade after decade after decade after decade in Canada. Race, Aboriginal, and gender are predisposed people or increase your risk of these diseases.
And as we've seen, not only does it play itself out in the stats, which is the basis of your information, but it also plays itself out on live TV with, for example, the unfortunate death of Joyce Echaquan, and it's not just in treatment or receiving health care or any of that. She was in a hospital dying, and they let her die, and she was able to film that. So that's another disparity of treatment in healthcare. Just my thoughts only.
Well, you're right. If we look at all of the people we've been talking about, so Rodney Levi, Chantal Moore, Ms. Echaquan, all of them were in contact with many government departments.
Yeah.
And each of these departments have failed them in order for them to get to the point where they were. Mm-hmm. So Ms. Moore or Mr. Levi being shot dead by the police, or Echaquan dying in agony in a hospital bed.
And the next thing that we want to discuss is systemic discrimination in the criminal justice system. And I'm not going to give a lot of specific examples. I'm sure there's lots that we can discuss. But I'll look at the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In Canada, we've got two specific sections I'll discuss today, Section 15.1 of the Charter, and also Section 35. And Section 15.1 guarantees the equality of treatment, the equality of rights, the equality of protection under the law. Section 35 has similar doctrine as it relates to Indigenous members of our community and First Nations. But notwithstanding those guarantees, the Minister of Justice of Canada most recently admitted and apologized for the systemic discrimination that exists within the criminal justice system. Statistics would suggest that if you're Indigenous, you're 6 or 7 times more likely to be arrested and end up in jail. If you're black, you're 2 or 3 more times to end up more likely to end up in jail or be arrested, because the populations of our prison systems would dictate that. Now, that in and of itself, those written protections clearly aren't providing positive outcomes for those two specific communities. But on a broader level, Canada has entered into agreements with the United Nations and other groups guaranteeing the end of racial discrimination. They have guaranteed that our country will end racial discrimination. I think that was back in the early 2000s under the UN. The agreement to end racial discrimination, I think, is exactly the name of that particular agreement. Now, back in 2007, I think, Canada sent some envoys back to the UN to say, yeah, we're good, we're implementing, everything's going well. But at the same time, and a few years later, the United Nations is condemning Canada for its treatment of its Indigenous population, as well as other minorities when it comes to systemic discrimination. So what's going on? We've got all of these statements of equality under the law and protection under the law, but why are we still rallying across the country? Why are we still asking for it? Why do we have this show? Are we making this up? Excuse me. Are we? All of these promises that have been made under the law being a lawyer, I have great respect for the law and the legislative process and the legal process, but why the hell isn't racial discrimination already a criminal act? Why do I have to walk down the street of my hometown and accept being called? Why is that? We've already agreed with all of the other nations, this is not acceptable and must be stopped. But yet we allow it to happen in every city and every town in our nation on a daily basis. And we throw money at NGOs to say, go fix it. You can't know and then not know. You can't be the federal government saying there is a problem and then not fixing it. Gentlemen, any suggestions?
Neil, if I can jump in there. The problem is that the default in Canada right now is contrary to the facts. The facts that we've said are NGOs are getting paid $8 to $10 million in New Brunswick.
In New Brunswick, and that's only one NGO.
That's correct, to address these issues. We look at the healthcare system and we say that blacks have worse health outcomes than Caucasians. We look at the criminal justice system. We say Indigenous and black people make up much more of the population than their demographics in the population. So racism is responsible in large part for this. But when we have a conversation about trying to prove racism in Canada, the default is you have to prove that racism happened. And I think the default should change. The proof is in the pudding. If you look at the health outcomes, if you look at the criminal justice system, if you look at the prison rates,
the proof is available.
Racism is there. That's the explanation for why Indigenous people are 7 times more likely to be in the jail system. That's why blacks have worse health outcomes, because of systemic racism in large part. Might not be the only thing. So why is it that when we have a conversation about racism, we have to start from the default that it happened? Why don't we start from the default, yes, racial discrimination might be an explanation for this. So there was a person in Quebec City, or in the province of Quebec recently, a black PhD student who had reported something to the police. And when the police came, they actually arrested the student. And he spent 6 days in jail, and it was a case of mistaken identity. And then the Premier of Quebec came out and said, we don't know if this is racial discrimination or not, we have to do an investigation. That investigation starting from the default that you have to prove discrimination.
As is the default of all human rights commissions across the country.
And this is where I'm saying the proof is already there. We see the disadvantage that the blacks are at. We see the disadvantage that Indigenous people are at. So our society has to start from the premise there could be discrimination here. And if it's exonerated, that's fine. But those are the problems we need to address. And if we're always trying to spend our time proving that this exists, proving that it happens, trying to prove it, we can't make any
notwithstanding the leaders of our country stating quite unequivocally it exists.
The default should be to start off thinking that racial discrimination is relevant here. And by always making us prove that discrimination happened, we can't get to solutions, we can't get to remedies. And the system, the human rights approach in Canada is designed intentionally to achieve this outcome. So I think that if we can change our default position and accept that it's real, accept that it's happening, accept that it could be a causal contributing factor, then we can jump to solutions. But they keep us one argument behind, always trying to prove that it's happened.
It's a gatekeeper.
We are trying to prove, as a black community, as an Indigenous community, someone who experiences racism on a daily basis, we need to explain how this is racism to somebody who's never experienced racism, whether that usually they're white. So not only are we put in the position that we have to prove that the racism was there, but we're explaining it to someone who's never experienced racism in their life.
Exactly, and their perspective is much different. But again, getting back to my overall point, as a nation and the provinces within that nation, with the exception of Quebec, all have accepted that systemic discrimination exists. For the most part, all have said there needs to be an amelioration of systemic discrimination. We've entered into international agreements. You know, our leadership has made statements to the public, but yet here we are in this little town having to speak to a nation about something that's still ongoing. And my question is, when will it stop being that I know but I'm ignoring? Because once you know, you can't not know. But yet here we are in a situation of our leadership is in ignorance. They're saying it exists and then saying go fix it.
In one of our first episodes, I said that I want to take this idea and ram it down the government's throat. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that we need to ask their permission. I
Agreed.
don't think we need them to allow us. I think we have to take it. We have to tell them we have a legitimate stake in this. We are just as invested in this province as anyone else, and we contribute just as much as anyone else. And we are entitled to be represented. We are entitled to be part of the decision-making process, not where the government says we'll appoint a token person to a committee here or a committee there, but real meaningful participation.
Agreed. We too have had a vested and have been well grounded in the interests of the growth of this nation and our individual communities. And we too have a say, and we're telling you this is happening. We're telling you we want to have the authority to fix this. And we're telling you racial discrimination needs to be criminalized. We're not looking for handouts to organizations who can rub our backs and give educational assistance to those who may be ignorant to what we are experiencing. We're saying things need to be done. Things need to happen when these issues are identified. That, I believe, is the appropriate outcome. And we've been talking about the decriminalization of racial discrimination for a long time. And I believe that as humans, we respond to consequences, right? We respond well to consequences. We also respond well to the presents we get at Christmas, right? And I'm suggesting if there is a consequence to racial discrimination under the criminal law, that we'll get some activity quite quickly. Those are my thoughts only on the criminalization of racial discrimination. I think it's a righteous activity that we should be working towards. Matthew, any final comments?
I think, when we look back, I think it's great that our chains of slavery have been taken off now, but it's clear, and you can still see that polished racism of now our chains are off, but now they're just trying to put dog collars on us.
Dog collars. Hashtag black dog growling.
I'd like to just summarize, Neil and Matthew, that once again, the outcomes matter. If we look at the funding that NGOs have received for decades, we still have pretty all-white Caucasian government officials, elected officials at our municipalities, police departments, police boards, and commission. That's just a fact. So then one could challenge, is the work those organizations doing actually achieving the outcome? Exactly. If we look at the health outcomes for blacks and the prison statistics, once again, the facts are the facts. So we really have to, as a society, change the discussion from whether racism exists to how are we going to fix it. And by continuously making us prove that it happened, we're missing an opportunity.
Absolutely, Dr. Christie. Matthew, I want to thank you for your comments today. Very thoughtful. Dr. Christie, I appreciate your comments today. And as we've said before, if you want to comment also on this show, please feel free to reach out to us. NBWA at CHCO-TV. We want to know what you think. Provide us with your comments, provide us with your ideas. And if you don't like the show, please tell us. We want to know. I'm Neil Clements, and I want to thank you again for watching NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action.